So you've heard about RPGs, have you? RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons and GURPS and Apocalypse World and others. There's definitely Blades in the Dark, Quiet Year, there's 2. But did you know there are RPGs that you don't have to have friends who are willing to pretend to be elves or dwarves or cyberpunk cowboys to play? No, you can play them all by yourself. Yeah, you did know? They're called solo RPG. Yeah, okay, you knew that. Well, why don't you have a seat and we'll talk about some of them. I'll stay over here. What I'd like to do over the next 10 weeks is to take a closer look at 10 of these solo RPGs to kind of give a sense of the range and quality of solo RPG experiences that are available. Because, believe me, there's a lot. Before we do that, I'd like to give you sort of a sense of the territory, a map, if you will, to what's available in the solo RPG world and what it is that hopefully we can look forward to if I complete this series. It's my contention that there are 5 broad categories of solo RPGs that I want to sample from. The oldest, dating back nearly as far as the RPG itself, is the solo game book. These are somewhere between elaborate choose-your-own-adventure books and computer RPGs in paper form. They include series like Fighting Fantasy, Lone Wolf, Sorcery, and solo game books released under regular RPG lines like Tunnels and Trolls and Call of Cthulhu. Next are oracles and emulators. Now, these are systems that work in concert with whatever regular RPG you want to play and sort of take over, through random oracles and other techniques, the role of the GM, and sometimes other players as well. The most famous of these is Mythic, but there are many out there with different kinds of focus and intent. Next are RPGs designed from the ground up to be played solo. These can be played in a talking-to-yourself style, and actual play shows like Me, Myself, and I do just that. Or they can be silently daydreamed in the theater of the mind, maybe with some note-taking or journaling to keep things straight. These games often have oracles built into them, but the rules are built from the ground up to work solo. Many also have multiplayer modes, though. Ironsworn is probably the most famous, and if you look for recommendations for any kind of solo game on Reddit, you're going to get recommendations for Ironsworn. But another is Scarlet Heroes, and there's plenty of newer games like Wanderhome that make allowances for playing solo, too. Then there are journaling games, and I'm going to go ahead and throw in map drawing games with this category. There's considerable overlap. These are games which provide you with a structure and rules and usually prompts to generate a written record of your game. Usually in the form of something like letters or journal entries, but sometimes a map or even a series of videos or drawings. This is where I feel like the most innovation and design and play energy has been over the past year or two, with a virtual explosion of new games popping up every day on itch.io. Some big names in this category are 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, How to Host a Dungeon, Quill, Alone Among the Stars, The Beast, Artifact, and the Wretched and Alone games. And then there are the outliers that I'm roughly sort of grouping together as art games. Lyric games are a broad category of RPG and story games that are often motivated by more artistic and philosophical impulses that often play with the very notion of playability. They sometimes read like poems, and they often erase the distinction between player and character. A lot of them are arguably solo games. If you're familiar with Fluxus games by the likes of George Machunas or Yoko Ono, you'll recognize echoes of that in the lyric game world. Game poems, an earlier trend of story games that were meant for short runtimes and intense experiences, they also have some overlap with solo games and lyrics. There are also pervasive solo LARPs like the brilliant Brave Sparrow, and arguably some systems of fortune-telling or symbol interpretation like Spindle Wheel, they can fall in here too. Now, even with that incredibly broad final category that includes a lot of very disparate things, there's arguably stuff that can be considered a solo RPG that doesn't fit into any of my 5 categories. For a lot of people, the Faction Turn in Stars Without Number, for example, is a very compelling solo RPG, as are many other structures for GM Prep. Sometimes they're all described as lonely fun. It's a surprisingly big world, and over the next few weeks or so, I'm going to try and boil it down to just 10 games. If you want to play along, next week, we'll start with Tim Hutchings' brilliant and beloved 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. Link in the description.